Hello and welcome to another Atypical Philosopher video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce. This is a Ukraine War Update Extra video where I'll give you the extra tidbits and information concerning the war in Ukraine to give you a better view of the landscape of this conflict. My voice is a little bit croaky. I do have the lurgy today, so I do apologise for that. Where should we start? Well, it's not looking good for Ukraine going forward. This week could see a massive Russian bombing raid or missile attack or set of cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, all sorts, drones. They seem to adapt this punctuated approach where they fire a bunch of missiles, and then my guess is that they don't then have the missiles to fire again, so they need to then restock by gathering these missiles from wherever they can. I think they're running low, but it looks like they may just want to exhaust their missiles, because if they did, like I've said this before, if they fired these volleys on all these saturation rocket and missile attacks on consecutive days, Ukraine would struggle to be able to cope at all with that. But that they're waiting a week, I think, is a sign of Russia's inability to fire on consecutive days. Because I think if they could, they would. I'm sure, from a tactical point of view, that'd be far better, or strategic point of view. But they do wait, and I think they're scrabbling around and trying to get the missiles that they can. However, apparently things are looking bad for Ukraine because multiple Russian channels are reporting that Russia has prepared up to 20 strategic bombers from the Caspian Sea to strike. For this, additional Tu-95s were transferred from the Diaghilevo airfield to Engels. Previously known, more than 11 aircraft were used to strike at the same time. So this could be a doubling of missiles, certainly in that sort of manner. Russia is, another quote, Russia is finalizing preparations for a new missile attack. Kumenyuk, a spokeswoman for the press center of the Operational Command South. A missile carrier appeared in the Black Sea on combat duty. The carrier holds 8 caliber missiles on board. This indicates that the preparation is underway. One thing to note about when I keep saying that they don't have many missiles, and then I give you information that there are a bunch of missiles, you think, oh, that's a lot of missiles, they've got enough. But there are two things to remember. First of all, and I've said this before, that they need to keep some back for as a strategic reserve, just in case they get involved in any other big conflict. So if they use up all their missiles now, then NATO, they get into a proper one-on-one with NATO, they'd have absolutely nothing to defend Russia with. So they're not going to use up, their strategic reserves, one would think. The other idea to contemplate is that they've got ships all around the world, right? They could, because of the agreement, the Montreux Convention, which allows Turkey to shut the Bosphorus Straits, that tiny sort of entrance to the Black Sea, and that happened. That's a 1936 agreement, I think, or somewhere around there. They did that, Turkey, at the beginning of the war, and of all the things that have happened in this war, that's probably the most significant thing. We don't talk about it anymore, but Ukraine probably would have lost this war had Turkey not closed the Bosphorus Straits, because the entire Russian fleet, submarines and ships, would have been in the Black Sea and absolutely leathering Ukraine. But that has been unable to happen. What you got to remember is each of those ships and each of those submarines. So they're talking about a ship there carrying 8 caliber missiles on board, right? If each of those ships carry 8, possibly more, you multiply that out. That's where a load of their stock are. It's not like Russia have got this stock waiting in one single warehouse that they can suddenly throw out to these places that can fire into Ukraine, just like that. These missiles will be located all around the world in different sites, in different warehouses, in different ships and submarines. And to then suddenly get them all to the front lines or near the front lines in the Ukraine conflict takes quite a lot of effort. So that's just something to consider. Anyway, watch out for this. This might happen in a week, might happen in a couple of days, but there could be an absolute, hell to be unleashed on Ukraine if this is indeed true. On the flip side, finally, and I did mention this the other day, I think Reuters have got hold of uh, this idea that the US is weighing up sending in these 100-mile strike weapons to Ukraine. So at the moment, you've got 84-kilometer HIMARS range. So that's probably 50 miles. This is doubling the range of those rockets. And these are I did talk to you about these. These are, I think, a work between Saab and Boeing. These GLSDB missiles. So they are ground launch, small diameter bombs, one of about half a dozen plans for getting new munitions into production for Ukraine and America's Eastern European allies, the industry sources said. So the my issue there is production rather than having these, readily available. So the Pentagon is considering a Boeing proposal to supply Ukraine with cheap, small precision bombs fitted onto abundantly available rockets, allowing Kyiv to strike far behind Russian lines as the West struggles to meet demand for more arms. It could be delivered as early as spring 2023. So it's not like right now, but that isn't far away. Um, so it combines the GBU-39 small diameter bomb (SDB) with a M26 rocket motor, both of which are common in US inventories. And I don't know whether this is a case of putting a bomb on a rocket, basically, and therefore, if the bomb has some kind of pr- propellant capability, then you're basically putting two rockets together. It's not like one rocket that fires 100 miles, but one rocket that then releases another, and together that is 100 miles. I don't know. I'm sort of just trying to work that out myself, but that could be what's going on there. So there you go. That is certainly something that Ukraine need. Really, it's 8 ATACMS. Although the United States has rebuffed requests for the 185-mile, which is a 300-kilometer range 8 ATACMS, the GLSDB's 94-mile or 150 km range would allow Ukraine to hit valuable military targets that have been out of reach and help to continue pressing its counterattacks by disrupting Russian rear areas. So that definitely needs to happen. All of the above there. Russia are also starting to hit Ukraine logistically as well. So it's not that just that Ukraine is the one hitting, ground lines of communication, GLOCs, or other sort of important positions behind enemy lines. Russia have noticed that this is incredibly effective for Ukraine. They're starting to do that themselves. There's a train that was hit last week, and other pieces of logistics that Russia are now aiming for, rather than trying to go solely for these. Well, I've argued that Russia haven't been aiming for residential areas, but they've accidentally hit residential areas because they're not using particularly precise bombs. I don't think generally they are trying to hit with limited amounts of bombs that they have, or missiles that they have. They are trying to hit apartment blocks. I just think that they don't care when they do, particularly. And there's one analysis from Reporting in Ukraine, I think it was, who showed that these two residential areas that hit the other day happen to be very close to train lines, and is probably, you know, the most. It appears to be the most plausible explanation that they were trying to hit those train lines. They're just their CEP, circle error probable, isn't quite good enough, for the most to be as accurate as they would like. So there you go. I wrote an article yesterday. It's not an opinion piece. It's just more of a sort of factual one about the Belarus foreign minister. And I only mentioned this in passing the other day, but he suddenly died. So he went to CSTO, which is a kind of 6-nation um, answer to NATO of 6 former Soviet states. And they met in Armenia, I think it was. Yeah, because they had that's where the protests were. And Vladimir Makei, who has been the foreign minister in Belarus since 2012, he went there and then came back and then suddenly died. And we still don't have an explanation of how he died, no cause of death. And that's really odd. Now, Belarus have played an interesting game. Lukashenko has done just about enough to appease Putin, and he's committed enough stuff to appease Putin, but he hasn't actively got involved. So Belarusian troops aren't invading, and though the land is being used in Belarus, it's being used to launch aerial attacks, but I don't think that anything, and it's been used to house sort of training facilities and what have you. But it hasn't gone that next step. Lukashenko hasn't really done what the Kremlin want him to do. So this causes a bit of tension. And I think he's trying to play the international community and keep them enough on side, and at the same time keeping the Kremlin enough on side. I think he's done quite a clever job, Lukashenko, all things considered. Of course, morally speaking, he should have stood up to Putin and said, no, not at all. But, obviously that was never really going to happen. So Makei has pretty much said the same as Lukashenko. He's towed the party line with saying, yeah, we agree with the war and Russia's war, blah, blah, blah. But he hasn't really, committed to the extent I think that Russia would have liked. And then he suddenly dies. So the fears are, pro-Ukrainian sources are saying the fears are that he is, that they are, so pro-Ukrainian sources are saying that it looks like Russia could well be putting in a puppet, if not a leader, puppet foreign minister in his place. This 64-year-old just sort of drops dead, and then Russia are on hand, arguably, to put one of their own in place. Now, this comes on the back of the Robert Lansing Institute for Global Threats and Democratic Studies, which is a US-based think tank, that reported just literally like a day before, I think it was, Makei died, right? They said this. According to sources within the Russian military leadership, the Kremlin has made a decision on a radical solution to the issue of dragging Belarus into Russia's armed aggression against Ukraine. On the instructions of the Russian President Vladimir Putin, upon his return from the latest CSTO summit, the Russian military intelligence may attempt in the coming days to pursue a scenario involving either an assassination attempt targeting Belarus President Alexander Lukashenko or its imitation, with the aim of ultimately intimidating the latter and prompting him to finally order his troops to directly engage in the war in Ukraine alongside Russian troops, sources report. The Russian GRU headquarters is looking into this scenario, which involves Lukashenko being killed during the operation, as a result of which his duties will be entrusted to the incumbent CSTO General Secretary Stanislav Zas, who is fully loyal to Russia and under GRU's control. This is fascinating because as soon as that came out, the foreign minister suddenly dropped dead. And this looks entirely prescient. So that's a real worry because it could be a sign that Belarus are going to be more actively involved in the Russian war. Okay, let's get on to the main thing I want to talk about today, which is the winter war and the effects of winter on both sides. This is Thomas Tyner. So the reasons the winter months will kill 100,000 Russian soldiers, he says. Lack of winter clothing for Russian troops equals death by hypothermia. Garbage Russian logistics equals lack of warm food, tea, heating materials, sleeping bags, equals death by hypothermia. No shelters and dugouts for Russian troops to hide from the elements, death by hypothermia. Ground is frozen, you can't dig shelters anymore. Russian troops have to sleep on the ground, equals death by hypothermia. Russian troops can't make any fire equals smoke, which attracts drones and artillery. Frozen ground equals artillery become more effective. In summer, projectiles bury into the ground before detonating. Now the ground is frozen solid, more shrapnel. And lastly, frozen ground equals can't dig a foxhole, death by artillery. So all these sort of reasons put together show, lead Tyner to believe that, this will lead to 100,000 deaths of Russian soldiers. Putin knows it and is desperate to pause the war until spring. This is why all his lickspittles demanded Ukraine negotiate with Russia to pause the war. No negotiations, no operational pauses. Winter will help Ukraine liberate large swaths of land. Send winter clothes, artillery ammo, and night vision to help beat the Russians. Now, you could say that this is all equally applicable to the Ukrainians, or at least in part. They might have slightly better equipment, but they are still going to be in those same scenarios with building trenches, being unable to do that with a frozen ground, with the conditions, etc., etc. So this will not just be tough for Russian forces; it will be tough for Ukrainian forces as well. Jack Watling, this thread is I think really important. He's a senior research fellow, land warfare military sciences at the Royal United Services Institute, and he says there has been a lot of discussion around the effects of winter on operations. I thought I'd outline a couple of aspects of winter fighting that are both critical and often underappreciated. Winter will likely favor the Ukrainian military. So, how does he justify this? A lot of discussion has revolved around the question of mud and tanks. We'll circle back to this, but fundamentally, it is not significant. The real impact of winter is on infantry, secondly, on logistics, and the impact of logistics has a secondary effect on military vehicles. To begin with, infantry. Winter sees a lot of cover as trees lack foliage. That means you have to keep low. Unfortunately, low also means wet and muddy. Wet means cold. There is a limited period you can be wet and cold and remain alive. Being able to dry yourself and warm up in this environment takes a lot of personal discipline. It means keeping your wet and dry kit separate. It requires you to meticulously manage your ability to transition from one to the other in field conditions. If your dry kit gets wet, you are on a fairly short timeline to becoming combat ineffective and need to get somewhere where that has heat to dry yourself and your equipment. That probably means power or fire. Both of these things are scarce under field conditions. The endurance and capacity of a force to operate in the field away from shelters is therefore closely tied to their personal discipline and survival skills. It is vital that junior leaders keep a close eye on the people, and when someone gets cold and wet, withdraw them. Now, the Ukrainians spent years defending the JFO. Through winter, the joint forces, lots of the mobilized soldiers have experienced living in these conditions for months. The Ukrainian military also has reasonable junior leadership and people look out for one another. If you look at Ukrainian fighting positions, they tend to be well kept. People tend to have warm clothing, and defensive lines often have areas that are kept clean, dry, and warm. Company commanders build these close to fighting positions. Russian junior leadership has been heavily attrited. The newly mobilized personnel do not have the experience or skills to operate or for extended periods in the field. They have not been issued with winter clothing for the most part. Their fighting positions are often a mess, and I've shown you myself evidence of this previously. That will in itself see the Russians take casualties from exposure. It will also reduce the pace at which they can maneuver and make them even more dependent upon centralized nodes for soldiers to recover. Those nodes can be targeted. Just myself as an aside here, all that evidence of mobilized troops getting no training at all or very little training, they aren't going to be getting a load of training on how to survive in wet, cold conditions like this, and all the kind of little things you have to do to keep your kit dry, to build things in a certain way, to have, that's not going to be happening. These guys are going to be thrown onto the front line with very little care as cannon fodder. And so you will see a high attrition rate for these sorts of troops, I'm fairly sure. For the Ukrainian military, therefore, they can inflict a lot of casualties just by skirmishing to keep the Russians in their fighting positions and timing attacks to prevent unit rotation. The result will be a high rate of death through hypothermia and disease. So this is where the Ukrainians want to keep rotating as they are. They've done a pretty good job of rotating. I saw some troops coming off the front line in Bakhmut being rotated and just covered, in mud. But they're getting out. Shifting to logistics, most military support vehicles are wheeled, and both sides are heavily dependent upon commandeered civilian transport for resupply. People exaggerate how big a problem that is for tanks, but it is a huge problem for wheeled logistics vehicles. This means that logistics in winter is much more road bound, and this makes logistics vulnerable. It also narrows the number of axes along which resupply can move. A slow pace of resupply necessarily reduces the pace of operations. I showed you some images of some Maxar satellite images this morning of entrenchments, and they were generally entrenchments by trenches being built by roads and by ground lines of communication, rather than just out in the middle of random fields. So, because they know that roads are really important for attacking, but also obviously for supply as well. The impact on tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, therefore, is not that they can't maneuver, but it takes longer to resupply them, repair them, and recover them if they get in trouble. That reduces the ability to exploit breaches made in the line, so and so makes offensive action more costly. For the Ukrainian military, trying to rebuild combat power after its recent offences, the aim this winter should be to use artillery, skirmishing, and constant pressure to keep the Russians outdoors. The results will be bad for the Russian morale, discipline, and combat power. Inflicting the maximum number of casualties through exposure also creates a need for the Russians to replace losses, and this will see mobilized personnel pushed in with limited training rather than being held as new units. That should help Ukraine keep the initiative. So the winter may see a reduction in large-scale offensive action unless there is a collapse somewhere. That does not mean a reduction in fighting or the levels of ammunition consumption. So I thought that was a really useful analysis of what might happen. Now, here's some evidence of those kind of conditions. And just, look at the mud here. Look at the effect that it have on, infantry moving around and infantry living and having to deal with the mud. I showed you some really horrible images and video footage of some Ukrainian soldiers living in terrible trench conditions yesterday. It's just not great. So there you go. I've already spent a long time. What is it? Let's have a look at a few different things. So this is a bit of video footage of just a bunch of supply trucks burnt out here, but the number is pretty staggering. So we've got a minute of this guy, like, just passing truck after truck after truck, as Russian KAMAZ and other supply trucks just are evidently, destroyed, and it goes on and on. And to be honest, I have talked to you about this before in one of my early videos, but a lot of you are new. This is really important. So taking out trucks, especially when Russia is a railway logistics army. So as a railway army, it doesn't have enough trucks. It doesn't have enough trucks to fight the war it's fighting at the moment. Like I said before, America has about 100,000 trucks, whereas at the beginning of this conflict, Russia had about 4,000 trucks. That's 25 times less capacity than the Americans to do road-based supply and logistics. So they've had to pull in all sorts of trucks from everywhere, use a lot of civilian vehicles and all sorts. When you take out a truck, you're not just taking out the truck there with the supplies it might have in it and say, that's good, we've taken out a bit of supplies. You've taken out the ability for that truck to be used again, right? So assuming that one truck will be used virtually every single day to do, like, I don't know, 60-mile round trip, 60-mile trip there, maybe 120-mile round trip. You are, and all of the ammunition and supplies and whatever that truck will supply, not just the next day, but every single day for the rest of its working life. Think about the next 6 months. If that truck was working over 6 months, all of that work that truck would be doing. You've now taken that truck out from being able to do that. When you've taken a whole bunch of trucks, I don't know, let's just say there's 10 to 15 trucks here. Think of the capacity, the volume of stuff that those trucks can not only move in one day, but would be able to move over a month, 2 months, 6 months, 9 months. The importance of taking out these trucks is huge when the Russians struggle to move things outside of their rail network. They move things by hand. They get it off by hand in a very inefficient way from the rail cars, and then they put it by hand onto these trucks, and then they drive these trucks out, and then they take it off by hand, and it's all a very slow and cumbersome process. You take out a big bunch of those trucks, that becomes a nightmare. The Russians are really going to struggle. So hitting a whole column of these trucks is massively impactful on Russian ability to supply their army. Here is a a Turkish Kirpi armored personnel carrier. I don't know if it's specifically an MRAP, like a mine-resistant armored personnel carrier, but a mine has exploded and it's had a direct hit by a shell on the car. And despite that, all the crew survived. Everyone inside survived. Just have a look at this, and you think, oh, okay, its wheels have been blown off. Um, it's taken. I don't know whether the mine was underneath. The mine came in from the side, um, but it's done. It's done its job. This Turkish truck. It's done a really good job in keeping the people inside alive. It's taken a shell and a mine, and that's why these things are important. Get pretty decent kits. That looks to be where the shell hit. Get pretty decent kit, and you will your troops will survive with a greater probability. So here's an example of how difficult it is liberating areas. These are mine traps left by Russians in residential buildings in Kherson. So here's this guy. So he's showing you. Let me just make this a bit bigger. You see the line going across the stairway, and then these things there, the other side of the stairs. And that line going up there is just explaining that, it's booby trapped, mined, and whatever. So you just be walking, if you're rushing back to your apartment because you're like, yeah, I'm back, and then hit that, bang, you're gone. So it takes time to liberate areas, and that's why quite often, the Ukrainians take a lot longer to advance than you might think they should, because they need to be careful. Here's a bit of sort of propaganda. These are Chechen. It's a Chechen battalion claiming that they found caches of weapons in 20 villages on the left bank of the Dnipro. They say, look at all these weapons hauls that we found. And it turns out that almost all of these weapons are hunting rifles and shotguns. And look, just old, with a couple of other bits, but almost all of these are what people would have had personally in their homes for like hunting in like farms or whatever, or in certain areas. And therefore the claim that they found all these caches of weapons is just basically complete BS. But here they are claiming that and saying, look, how good are we? They're almost all hunting rifles. They just stole every hunting rifle in the region, looting people, Defmon says. Sorry, I realised that this video I've just recorded a whole lot went on way too long, so I split it into two to make it more manageable. The second part will be out later. Please like, subscribe, share. Thank you for all your support. There's YouTube thanks, buy me a coffee, PayPal down below, uasupporter.com/ATP. There's also becoming a channel member. Thank you to those who are members. And also buy my books if you would like. That's hugely appreciated. Anyway, I'll catch you later for the second part of this extra video.